Are we inherently good, inherently evil, or a mix of the two? It's an age-old question, and while I don't have the answer, I do have 10 people who absolutely suck. From terrible leaders to serial killers and just some plain old regular people who did horrific things. Here are the top 10 terrifying people who were born evil. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have Nero. To start off this list, we are going to be taking it back all the way to the age of the Roman Empire. When we think back to these times, they weren't necessarily the most kind, peaceful of times, but there certainly are some characters that stand out as being particularly brutal, and one of those is Nero. Throughout his reign, he wreaked havoc on the Roman Empire, he burned cities, he killed thousands of people, including every member of his own family, and I mean, we know the inventive execution methods of the past, so you can probably guess at just how brutal these all were. Most Roman sources give us an almost completely negative review of him in reference to both his personality and his reign as a leader. He was called compulsive and corrupt, and it is believed that he is actually to blame for the Great Fire that burned Rome, but instead he used the Christians as a scapegoat so that they would receive punishments rather than him. Real stand-up guy. In the end, after being declared a public enemy by the Roman Senate and realizing that the rebellion would be lost, he ended up taking his own life at the age of 30. In our number 9 spot today we have Robert Pickton. This horrible person is one of the worst Canadians to have ever lived and is one of our country's worst serial killers ever. Pickton dropped out of school and began working at his family's pig farm, and this is where most of his absolutely horrific crimes took place. He was first arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007 of taking the lives of 6 people, but throughout an extremely lengthy investigation, evidence of many more killings came to light. During his time in jail, an undercover police officer posed as his cellmate, and Pickton confessed to 49 crimes to him. Apparently, he was saying to the undercover officer that he wanted to take one more life to make it an even 50, and that he only got caught because he was sloppy. The entire trial was a bit of a mess, but it did lead to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which was the longest possible sentence under Canadian law at the time. This unfortunately does mean that he will be eligible for parole within the next decade, which is a terrifying thought, but being eligible doesn't mean he's going to get it, so there's always hope. In our number 8 spot today we have Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine was a New Orleans socialite who was an evil person behind closed doors. It is said that in public Delphine was polite and appeared as if she cared for those who were enslaved in her home, which is truly the most bizarre sentence I've ever said, but I guess back then that was considered being a good person. I digress. Delphine's social standing remained until on April 10th, 1834, authorities responded to a fire at her Royal Street mansion. When they arrived and went inside, no one was prepared for the horrors that they were about to see, as they discovered bound slaves in her attic who had clear signs of violent behavior over a long period of time. Following this, her house was swarmed by an outraged group of New Orleans citizens, but somehow Delphine was able to escape with her family to France. While the angry group destroyed her entire home, Delphine never faced any punishments for her crimes, which is probably the most frustrating ending to this entire story. In our number 7 spot today we have Alexander Solonik. Alexander was known as Alexander the Great, but I'm not sure if great is the word I would use to describe him. He was a Russian gangster who was a pretty notorious hitman for the Russian criminal world. He started out as a member of the Soviet army, but he was quickly kicked out for his violence towards suspects. He actually ended up in prison for some of the things he did. After 2 years he ended up escaping, and this is when his contract killing career started. After a few years of living this life, he was apprehended by the police. Once at the station, he revealed a small automatic weapon that they had failed to find on him, and he opened fire on the officers. He ran outside where he hit 2 more officers, but he ended up cornered and hit by a shot himself. After being jailed for a second time, he ended up escaping from prison again, and this time he disappeared. He was later found in Greece with a fake passport, and it was here where he started his own little gang of around 50 men, which were of course all involved in shady activities. In 1997, however, his body was found just outside of Athens, and this time the tables had turned and he was someone else's victim. Authorities found evidence that he had been hired to carry out a hit in Italy before his death, and these two things just may be correlated. In our number 6 spot today we have Elizabeth Wettlaufer. Elizabeth is a former registered nurse and serial killer who was responsible for taking the lives of 8 and attempting to take the lives of another 6 senior citizens who were under her care. With a total of 14 victims that either passed away or were harmed by her actions, She is now one of the worst serial killers Canada has ever seen. And not to mention how she was doing these things to vulnerable people that she was supposed to have devoted her life to taking care of. Her first victim who passed away was James Silcox, who was 84 in 2007 and was a World War II veteran. She committed her crimes by injecting insulin into her patients. In September of 2016, Liz ended up entering herself into a drug rehabilitation program at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which is located here in Toronto. It was here that she ended up confessing to her horrific crimes. Of course, the staff at the hospital notified the proper authorities and she was subsequently arrested, and she gave police a 2-hour-long confession. She admitted to knowing that what she did was wrong, but she said she just had urges she couldn't control. She stated that, quote, God or the devil or whatever wanted me to do it. In the end, she was sentenced to life in prison, but because of the way that the Canadian system works, at some point she will be eligible for parole. In our number 5 spot today, we have Pedro Lopez. Pedro is a man who lived a life committing some of the most horrific crimes I've ever even heard of throughout South America in the 1970s. By the time the 1980s rolled around, he made a mistake during one of his awful crimes, and this led to his arrest. Once in police custody, he began to basically explain his entire life story, and he confessed to an astronomical amount of crimes. People were a little skeptical of just how many crimes he said he committed, but Pedro was able to lead them to a mass grave where they recovered a total of 53 people's remains. Pedro, of course, went to jail, but get this, he was somehow released in 1994. I'm like, great. Just before I was born. Nice. He wasn't sent home straight away and instead was sent to some sort of mental institution for 3 years, but he was also released from there. Okay, so aside from the crimes he committed, are you ready for the worst part? In 2002, he was suspected of being the perpetrator of a new crime, but no one has been able to find him since 1998. Yeah, he disappeared. Awesome. In our number 4 spot today, we have Ilse Koch. Ilse is a war criminal who oversaw concentration camps that were run by her husband, Karl Otto Koch. She is well known due to her sadistic and brutal treatment of prisoners, and she became one of the first well-known people that committed these types of crimes to be tried by the US military. It is said that those being held at the camps with distinctive tattoos, Ilse would take a piece of their skin as souvenirs. When being charged with her crimes, they included things like private enrichment, embezzlement, as well as taking the lives of some prisoners to prevent them from testifying. In the original trial, she was acquitted for lack of evidence, although her husband was sentenced to death by an SS court in Munich. After a few more trials, however, she ended up being sentenced to life in prison, and despite multiple appeal attempts, she was never released. In our number 3 spot today, we have Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a Georgian revolutionary and Soviet political leader who governed the Soviet Union from 1922 until his death in 1953. Despite the fact that he started his time governing the country as part of a collective leadership, by the 1930s he had consolidated all of the power and went on to begin acting as the Soviet Union's dictator. During his reign, Stalin was responsible for the deaths of over 60 million people, 20 million of them being his own. Apparently the math works out to be about 40,000 people per week, which is truly unbelievable. It is worth noting, especially since this list is about people who were born evil, that there were good things that he did at some point or another. I mean, Stalin's forces did start out as an Axis power in World War II, and he did help us out a great deal and helped to bring down you-know-who, but in the end, that good can't eliminate the harm that he did. Also, before he was in power, it is said that as a young man, he was a robber and an assassin. For almost 30 years, he reigned the Soviet Union with terror and violence. I mean, his decisions led to a famine that killed millions of people alone. Also, the lives he took weren't just of enemies. I mean, how could one person have 60 million enemies? He would take the lives of the families of people he liked. He just took too many lives, was too paranoid, and while he was powerful and smart, he was also an absolute monster. This is all perfectly summed up when he said, quote, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is simply a statistic." In our number 2 spot today, we have Pol Pot. Pol Pot was the leader of the Cambodian revolutionary group called the Khmer Rouge, and this group, with him at the forefront, went on to try and destroy Cambodian civilization. This wasn't necessarily how the group started out, but once Pol and others who shared his ideas came to lead it, things quickly quickly became dark. He is likely one of the only people who ordered a mass genocide in his own country. The reasoning behind all of this is because he believed that destroying the civilization was the best way to start a new regime and bring in a new age. He ended up serving as the prime minister from 1976 until 1979, during which his policies led to the deaths of around 2 million people, which is horrifying. That was about 25% of the entire population. He even liked to keep the skulls of those he had killed. I'm just gonna say, it seems as though politics was the mask for someone who just really wanted to kill. There are so many horrific details surrounding him and the things he did, some of which I can't even repeat here on YouTube, and that is exactly how he landed a spot here on today's list. He truly did some horrendous things and in the end went on to live the rest of his life and died of natural causes before he could answer for any of his crimes. In our number 1 spot today we have Heinrich Himmler. Alright, this is one real piece of work who was very active on what we'll call the bad team during World War II, and he is actually one of the people who really helped to create and build the Holocaust. He was the head of the SS and he controlled concentration camps, and you wanna know what he was best known for? His organizational skills and for picking the best subordinates. Yeah, they really liked him because he was able to pick the other best, worst people ever to work with him. That's absolutely insane. They say opposites attract, but in this case it was just terrible people joining other terrible people. He believed that certain groups of people, like Jewish people, were unworthy of living, and he himself ordered the deaths of 6 million. It is completely unimaginable just how evil this person really was. This hasn't exactly been verified, but it's something that's been said for years, and that is that he had furniture made from the skins and bones of these people. In the end, because he was nothing but a coward, when things for him and his party started to go south, he tried to have open peace talks with the Western allies behind the back of you-know-who. Of course, he found out and had Himmler dismissed from all of his posts and ordered his arrest. This led Himmler to trying to go into hiding, but he was detained and then arrested by British forces once his identity became known. To make this story even worse, while in custody he took his own life because of course he didn't want to answer for his terrible actions. Alright guys, that has been our terribly dark list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!